In the bitter cold of an Anzio beachhead, Private Thomas Riley huddled against a muddy wall, his gers numb as he clutched a worn pencil. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and the dim light from a makeshift lantern cast long shadows across his trembling hand. The Battle of Anzio was hell. Every soldier knew it. A brutal campaign where the ground was as deadly as the enemy, where survival seemed more like a cruel joke than a possibility. But for Thomas, these letters were his lifeline, a thin connection to a world that felt impossibly distant. It was January 1944. The Allied forces had landed on this stretch of Italian coastline, hoping to break through German defenses and push towards Rome. But the Germans were dug in, waiting, and the American soldiers found themselves trapped in a brutal, grinding battle that would become one of the most challenging campaigns of World War II. Thomas came from a small farm outside Milwaukee. He was 22, had never been more than 50 miles from home before the war. His hands, once cold used from farm work, now knew only the feel of a rifle and the weight of survival. But every chance he got, he wrote home. The letters would later be discovered, decades after the war, tucked into an old metal box his family had kept, pristine yet fragile, a window into a moment when young men faced impossible odds and wrote to keep their humanity alive. His first letter home spoke of the landscape, not the horror, not the constant threat of death, but the strange beauty of a place so different from Wisconsin. "The beach here is nothing like home," he wrote. "It's wide and flat, with sand that looks more like gray dust than anything golden. The water is cold, angry, nothing like the quiet lakes back home." Between the lines you could read the unspoken tension, the fear, the sense that every moment might be his last. Anzio was a meat grinder. The Germans had perfect positioning with artillery and machine gun nests that could sweep the entire beachhead. American soldiers were pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat. They dug foxholes, created makeshift shelters, and waited. Thomas wrote about the small details, how they kept warm, what they ate, the camaraderie that kept them human in a place that seemed determined to strip away everything human. "Jimmy from Ohio found a can of peaches yesterday," one letter read. "First fresh fruit we've seen in weeks. We shared it like it was liquid gold. These are the moments that keep us going." The letters revealed something profound about war. It wasn't just about battles and strategies. It was about connection, about remembering who you were when the world around you seemed determined to make you forget. His mother saved every letter. Each one was a signal that her son was still alive, still thinking, still Thomas. The Battle of Anzio would last 4 months, over 50,000 casualties, men trapped in a landscape that seemed designed by some cruel god to test human endurance, and through it all, soldiers like Thomas wrote. They wrote to mothers, fathers, sweethearts. They wrote to prove they were still alive, still human. Thomas's letters spoke of hope, not the grand sweeping hope of victory, but the small fragile hope of survival, of returning home, of seeing another sunrise that wasn't filled with artillery fire and the screams of wounded men. In one letter dated February 12, 1944, he wrote something that would become a testament to the human spirit. "We are more than this moment, more than this beach, more than this war." Those words would be discovered decades later, a quiet rebellion against the brutality surrounding him. A promise, a prayer. The story of Anzio is often forgotten, overshadowed by more famous battles, but for the men who were there, it was everything. A crucible that tested not just military strategy but human endurance. Thomas Riley would survive. He would return home. But the letters remained a document of a moment when young men faced the worst humanity could offer, and still found ways to hold on to hope. The war changed Thomas, as wars inevitably changed those who survived them. When he returned to his small town in Minnesota, he was not the same young man who had eagerly enlisted 2 years earlier. His mother noticed it first, the way his eyes would suddenly go distant during family dinners, how he flinched at sudden loud noises, how he kept his letters from the war locked in a small cedar box in his bedroom. He worked at the local lumber mill, his hands now strong and calloused from years of military service and manual labor. The other veterans in town understood without needing to speak. They had a silent language, a shared understanding that those who hadn't been there could never fully comprehend. Sarah Peterson, who worked at the town library, was the first person Thomas truly opened up to about his experiences. She had lost her brother in the Pacific Theater, and there was a mutual recognition in their grief. One afternoon, as autumn leaves drifted outside the library window, Thomas pulled out a handful of his preserved letters, his hands trembling slightly. "These aren't just memories," he told her. "They're proof. Proof that we survived. Proof that humanity exists, even in the worst moments." Sarah understood. She had seen the photographs, read the accounts, but hearing Thomas speak, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes, made the war feel immediate and real in a way no history book ever could. The letters became more than personal memories. Local historians became interested. The county museum requested copies. Thomas was hesitant at first, protective of these intimate documents that represented the most vulnerable period of his life. But gradually, he recognized that these weren't just his stories. They were collective stories of an entire generation. What emerged was a complex portrait of war that went beyond heroic narratives. Thomas's letters revealed the mundane alongside the terrifying discussions of a shared chocolate bar, the brief humor that erupted even in dire circumstances, the complex relationships between soldiers who became closer than brothers. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Halleck, had been killed during the Anzio campaign. Thomas wrote about him with a mixture of respect and profound loss. Halleck wasn't just a superior officer but a mentor who had guided many young soldiers through their first experiences of combat. In one particularly poignant letter, Thomas described how Halleck would share stories of his own family back in Pennsylvania, creating moments of normalcy in an environment deadened by constant danger. The town began to see Thomas differently. He wasn't just another returning soldier but a storyteller, a keeper of memories. Veterans from subsequent wars in Korea, Vietnam, later conflicts would seek him out, recognizing in him a kindred spirit who understood the complex emotional landscape of military service. His letters also revealed unexpected moments of humanity. There were accounts of brief, almost surreal interactions with German prisoners, moments of shared human vulnerability that transcended the brutal conflict. One letter described a wounded German soldier being treated by American medics, a scene that challenged the simplistic narratives of absolute enemy and absolute ally. As years passed, Thomas became something of a local historian. School groups would visit him, listening intently as he shared not just his own experiences, but the broader context of the war. He was careful never to glorify conflict, always emphasizing the human cost, the individual stories that got lost in grand historical narratives. The cedar box that once held his wartime letters became a kind of sacred object in his family. His children and grandchildren would eventually understand the profound significance of these documents, not just as personal memories but as historical testimony. When Thomas died in 1992, at the age of 72, the entire town mourned. His funeral was attended by veterans from multiple generations, by historians, by family members who understood that they were saying goodbye to more than just one man. They were saying goodbye to a living connection to a pivotal moment in human history. The letters remained, carefully preserved. They continued to tell a story of resilience, of hope, of the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to maintain their humanity in the most inhuman of circumstances. Years after Thomas's death, his granddaughter Elena discovered additional context within the letters that had been previously overlooked. Archival research and careful cross-referencing revealed nuanced details about the soldiers Thomas had written about, their lives before and after the war, the interconnected stories that had remained silent for decades. She worked with local historians and the county museum to create a comprehensive archive. The letters were carefully digitized, preserving not just the physical documents but the delicate emotional landscape they represented. Each page told a story beyond the words, the pressure marks from his pen, the slight yellowing of the paper, the occasional coffee stain that spoke of hurried writing in uncertain moments. Some of Thomas's fellow soldiers had surviving children and grandchildren. Elena began reaching out, collecting additional fragments of memory. What emerged was a mosaic of human experience, not just a war story but a deeply human narrative about connection, survival and resilience. The town library established a special collection dedicated to veterans' personal narratives. Thomas's letters became the cornerstone of this collection, inspiring other families to share their own historical documents. It wasn't just about preserving military history, but about understanding how individual human experiences shape collective memory. Researchers from several universities became interested in Thomas's documentation. His nuanced, deeply personal account challenged many traditional historical narratives about World War II. He hadn't written about grand strategic movements or heroic battles, but about the small, profound moments that truly dared human experience during wartime. Elena discovered something unexpected in her grandfather's letters, drafts of stories he had begun writing but never completed. These fragments offered even deeper insights into his experiences, revealing a creative spirit that had been waiting to transform raw memories into something more universal. The cedar box that had held his wartime letters became a family heirloom passed down through generations. Each new custodian understood their responsibility, not just to preserve a physical object, but to maintain the emotional and historical integrity of the memories contained within. By the early 2000s, Thomas's letters had become more than a personal archive. They represented a bridge between generations, a testament to the human capacity for empathy and understanding, even in the most challenging circumstances. Young students would visit the library, reading photocopies of the original letters, connecting with a history that felt immediate and raw. In quiet moments, Elena would sit with the letters, tracing her grandfather's handwriting, understanding that these documents were more than historical artifacts. They were a form of love for his fellow soldiers, for his country, for the complex, imperfect world he had experienced. The story of Thomas and his letters became a reminder that history is not just about grand events, but about individual human experiences. Each letter was a small window into a world that had passed, yet remained vibrantly alive in memory and imagination. As decades moved forward, the letters continued to speak a quiet, persistent narrative of humanity's capacity to maintain dignity, compassion, and hope, even in the darkest of times. 20 years after Elena first discovered the letters, her own daughter Sophie would sit in the same library, carefully turning the fragile pages. The transmission of memory felt like a sacred inheritance. Sophie understood that these weren't just her great-grandfather's words, but a living connection to a history both painful and profound. She noticed details her mother and grandmother had missed, subtle references to landscapes, brief mentions of friendships forged in impossible circumstances, small observations about human resilience that transcended the specific moment of war. During a quiet afternoon research session, Sophie realized something remarkable. The letters weren't just a personal narrative, but a universal testament to human vulnerability and strength. Thomas had captured something elemental about the human experience. How ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances with grace, fear, hope, and an unbreakable spirit of connection. Her grandmother Elena, now in her late 80s, would occasionally visit and sit beside her, their hands touching the same paper that had traveled across oceans and generations. No words were necessary between them. The letters spoke their shared language of remembrance and understanding. In those moments, the boundary between past and present seemed to dissolve. Thomas's handwriting, his careful script describing moments of terror and tenderness, became a bridge connecting 3 generations of women who had learned to honor memory not through grand gestures, but through quiet, persistent acts of listening and preservation. The cedar box remained, a silent guardian of these intimate histories. Each generation would add its own layer of meaning, its own interpretation, ensuring that the story continued to breathe and evolve. Sophie understood then that memory was not static, but a living, dynamic process of continuous revelation and connection.